Friends, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Rabbi Eric Polikoff here of B'nai Israel. I was once at a conference of rabbis where the moderator desperately implored his colleagues. The moderator said, "Please keep your questions to questions." The same guidance can be helpful in introductions, as I will momentarily invite forward my friend and colleague, Rabbi Mark Cohen, to introduce tonight's speaker. Several area colleagues and institutions have made tonight possible, a sort of Jewish who's who near I-84. We are grateful to Rabbi Cohen and Temple Shalom of New Milford, B'nai Israel, and our Israel Advocacy Committee, who also prepared the rally and banners and posters. And Ellen and Harvey, can I just have you stand? You did such a great job with that, truly. Thank you. The Jewish Federation of Western Connecticut for their generous support and coordination, and with a special shout out to the Federation's events and program manager, Kathy Conti. Rabbi James Green and the Greater Washington Coalition for Jewish Life. Cantor Lila Sugarman and the United Jewish Center of Danbury. And our colleague, Rabbi Rebecca Gutterman and Temple Beth David of Cheshire. We also have an all-star team of notable government officials, distinguished clergy, and community leaders. We welcome Congresswoman Johanna Hayes. Southbury First Selectman Jeffrey Manville. Southbury Selectman Jason Bucksbaum. Southbury former First Selectman Ed Edelson. Clergy seeking to be here tonight: the Reverend Brian Boat, the Reverend Daniel Holmquist, the Reverend Abigail Johnson, the Reverend Marston Price. Rabbis: Rabbi Yehezkel Landau, Rabbi Michael Farbman, Rabbi Rona Shapiro, Rabbi Eric Silver, Rabbi Eisenbach. Joining us as well this evening will be Kathy Taylor from the Connecticut Community Foundation, Joel Lohr, the president of Hartford International University, and David Warren of the Hartford Jewish Federation. One final recognition. Yossi, welcome back. It's been a while, and we're delighted. As Rabbi Cohen will explain, you seem to have kept yourself quite busy in the interim. And the reality is this: we're here tonight because you're one of the leading interpreters of Israel to America. The stakes are increasingly high in both lands, and that demands of us all more learning, engagement, and advocacy. Rabbi Cohen?
Good evening. Thank you, Rabbi Polikoff. First, I want to just echo everything that my colleagues said. And Yossi, you should know that when we started reaching out for sponsors and to make tonight happen, everyone, they just couldn't say yes fast enough, which, as you know, in the Jewish world is no small feat. Many of us know Yossi Klein Halevi as a blog writer in the Times of Israel. I got to know Yossi best when I had the good fortune to be a student of his and so many fine scholars at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, where he serves as a senior fellow and the co-director of the Muslim Leadership Initiative. Yossi's scholarship is known to many of us here through his books, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, Like Dreamers, At the Entrance of the Garden of Eden, and Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist. In my household, we have a saying: once we have heard Yossi speak, we know what to think. Okay, maybe not just Yossi, but Yossi, you're up there with our top 3 or 4 or 5. But writers and podcasters who are part of our necessary daily diet, really whenever you post. Yossi, it's not just what you say, it's how you say it. How you engage an issue and where you are willing to do that which we almost seem programmed not to do, which is to change our mind. You change your mind while remaining firmly planted in the ground and never losing sight of what certainly appear as your fundamental values and purpose, which is to be a scholar with proper citations and reasoned arguments on matters as diverse as political strategies and personalities to music genres and cultural impacts. To be a journalist who seeks not social or justice advocacy, but seeks to expose, reveal, enlighten. Yossi, you are a proper thinker, an observant Jew, a compassionate and understanding soul. You hold on to being a loyal son of a Holocaust survivor and to be a mensch. You come to us on this night with a title that we formulated so it could be relevant for our May 9th date, knowing full well that we would have no idea where the Jewish world would be, where Israel would be at this point. And thus our title, What Has Changed in the Jewish World Since October 7th? Yossi, so often I hear Jewish leaders speak about October 7th as if that was the moment and the only moment to which we are responding, and of course it is far more than that. That being said, a personal story, in early January, my wife Amy and I had just celebrated our 2nd wedding anniversary. Sometime in late February, someone asked me how long we were married, and I said, a year and a half. Amy looked at me quizzically, having just celebrated our 2-year anniversary, and I said, what? We were married in January of 22. It was February 24 suddenly. Time had stopped for me on a certain level on October 7th. And while we go through time, after all the trees are leafing out, clearly it's May. But time has stopped. And on the one hand, I'm at October 7th or 8th, but on the other, so much has changed in Israel and in the States. Tonight, Yossi, with your eyes and your mind, with your heart and your soul, you will please tell us what has changed for Israel and for world Jewry since October 7th. Ladies and gentlemen, Yossi Klein Halevi.
Good evening, everyone. Oh, I have to turn this on. Right. Hi, everyone. Good evening. You can hear me? No. We worked on this. We really worked on this. Now? Okay, great. So, Rabbi Eric, Rabbi Mark, Rabbi Rebecca, Rabbi Rona, all the rabbis, Congresswoman Hayes, really delighted to be with all of you. And I'd like to especially welcome my beloved friends, Yecheskel and Joyce, who are part of your extended community. I don't know geographically how far this stretches, but they're here tonight. This is a moment that we refer to in Israel as the secular high holidays of the Jewish calendar. Beginning with Holocaust Memorial Day, which we just observed. We'll do this instead.
No, in addition.
So beginning with Holocaust Memorial Day, which we observed the other day. Moving to Memorial Day for the fallen soldiers, which we'll be observing in the coming days, following immediately by Israeli Independence Day. And in Israel, we refer to these days as the time of moving from destruction to renewal. And these 3 days are really a kind of a map of the modern Jewish experience. On Holocaust Memorial Day, we mourn the consequences of powerlessness. On Memorial Day for the fallen Israeli soldiers, we mourn the consequences of power. And on Independence Day, we celebrate what until October 7th was the happy ever after of the modern Jewish story. This is a moment, this Independence Day, this is a moment where on the one hand, everything is clear and nothing is clear. What is clear, first of all, is that when you have genocidal enemies on your border and they threaten to destroy you, believe them. Over the last 20 years, really since Israel withdrew from Lebanon and allowed Hezbollah to come right on the border, and then with the rise of Hamas in 2007, we gradually found ourselves surrounded on almost every border by genocidal enemies, by enemies whose intention, whose stated intention, is the destruction of Israel. We lived under the sweet illusion that you can somehow coexist with that threat. You can manage that threat. And we now know that you can't live a normal life or the pretense of a normal life. Life in Israel is never normal. But we live the pretense of daily life, and that is untenable because one day you're going to wake up into October 7th. And so what is clear is that the illusion is over. And we now know that we cannot live literally meters away from terror organizations, entities, states that are committed to our destruction. What's clear as well is the meaning of the slogan, "From the river to the sea." On October 7th, Hamas made explicit what would await the fate of nearly 8 million Jews in Israel if Hamas were ever to be in control from the river to the sea. We also know we're living with the astonishing fallout of the rise of global anti-Semitism in a way that I would argue we have never experienced the extent, the global extent of anti-Semitism as we are at this moment, partly because of social media. And we are experiencing this eruption of violent hatred at precisely the moment when we experienced a kind of pre-enactment of the vision of our genocidal enemies. This in some way is the ultimate Jewish nightmare, to be accused of genocide after experiencing a genocidal moment. And the fact that the slogan "From the river to the sea" has been adopted by students across this country at precisely the moment when we now understand fully what that slogan means is something that I will never understand. So on the one hand, the nature of the threat, the pathologies that we're facing could not be more clear. On the other hand, nothing is clear. We're facing the most complicated moral dilemma that Israel has ever faced. We're fighting the most brutal war that we have ever faced. Most of us in Israel, almost all of us, believe we have no choice but to fight this war. Nevertheless, we've never fought a war as ugly as this, as devastating as this. And we are being led at this moment by a government that, to my mind, has no moral standing. And the untenability of trying to maintain our credibility with this government is something that haunts me every day. I don't believe that we can win this war with this government. This government not only does not have moral standing around the world, it also lacks moral standing within its own people. And that is to distinguish between the support of the people of Israel for this war, which really must be emphasized, along with the deep lack of trust in our leadership. The fact that there's no morning after policy, that this government doesn't have the courage, that Netanyahu doesn't have the courage to face down the far-right wing of his government and present a credible plan for what ruling Gaza would look like the morning after, hampers our ability to marshal our friends. And so there is a sense of deep drift in Israel and certainly in the diaspora. I've been on the road now on a lecture tour for the last 2 months, and I don't need to tell you, you all know what I've been hearing and experiencing. Fear, anxiety of the future, a sense that American Jews are at a critical turning point in the history of your community. And a question mark about the future of Israel. The most acute dilemma that we're facing, in some ways the most acute, ambivalent experience of this period, is the fate of the hostages. And Israelis often will say, as you did, Mark, which is that time has become, in some sense, elastic, unreal. I never know what date it is, and often I'm not sure of the month. And it really is still October 7th, in large part because of the hostages. Because for the hostages, it's still October 7th. And for Israeli society, we are stuck psychologically, emotionally in October 7th. What makes the dilemma of how to proceed so excruciating is that we're facing a choice between two essential elements of the Israeli ethos. On the one hand, we've been committed as a society since October 8th to destroy the governing capacity of Hamas. And we're not there yet. We all know we're not there yet. And that touches on the deepest elements of the Zionist ethos, of Jewish self-defense. To leave in power on our border the regime that did that to the Jewish people would be a violation, an historic violation, of the commitment that we made to ourselves to protect the Jewish people. That's one element of the Israeli ethos. And so when parts of Israeli society say that with all of the pain involved and all of the need to rescue the hostages, the priority must be bringing Hamas down, part of me resonates with that. The problem is there's another element of the Israeli ethos, which is in competition. And that goes back to the traditional Jewish commitment of what we call in Hebrew pidyon shvuyim, the redemption of captives. For 2,000 years of exile, Jewish solidarity across the world was defined by a shared commitment to rescue Jewish prisoners wherever, in whatever part of the diaspora they happen to be. And that commitment was absorbed into the Israeli ethos, and it was expressed by the IDF ethos, which is you never leave a soldier behind. You don't leave a corpse behind. In 2012, we traded 1,000 Hamas terrorists for one Israeli soldier. That was the fulfillment of the ethos of Pidyon Shvuyim. The problem is that we now know that that deal, the deal to rescue the Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit, also freed Yihya Ayash and hundreds of Hamas terrorists who participated in the October 7th massacre. And so many of us are asking ourselves, was the price worth it? We are debating with ourselves. I wouldn't say that there are two rival camps in Israel as much as two torn parts of ourselves. I come out on this issue in different places at different times. And I think that that's very much the norm in Israel. What is so disorienting for me as an Israeli being in this country for the last 2 months is how radically different the war is perceived by large parts of the American public, including parts of the Jewish community, and by virtually the entirety of Israeli society. And that is that in Israel, there is really no disagreement about the moral necessity of this war. There certainly is disagreement about whether we're winning the war. There is some disagreement, to my mind, not enough discussion about the ways in which the war is being fought. We need to have that conversation. But when you look at the protests that are erupting in Israel, there are really about two goals. The first is to pressure the government into prioritizing the release of the hostages, even over the defeat of Hamas. That's one line of demonstration, and that's being led by the families of the hostages. The other demonstration is to bring the government down. And as someone who spent much of the last year devoted to trying to bring this government down, my heart goes out to both demonstrations, to both movements. I'm not sure this is the moment for either. Nevertheless, emotionally, I'm with both. But what's important here to emphasize is that there are no demonstrations in Israel against the war itself. I can't remember the last time when Israelis weren't demonstrating against the government about something, let alone something as controversial as this war. Every previous war in the last, since the first Lebanon War of 1982, which was Israel's first asymmetrical conflict, the first war that pitted a conventional army, the IDF, against terrorists embedded in a civilian population. Since 1982, every one of our asymmetrical wars has generated a protest movement in Israeli society. Not this one, the most brutal of all of our wars, and no one's demonstrating against it. The left is quiet. And that gives you some indication not only of the profound shock and rage that Israelis feel across the political spectrum, but of the deep sense of justice that almost all Israelis feel in the goal of this war, which is to destroy Hamas as a governing body. Israelis perceive this war as an existential moment. Now, by existential, I don't mean that if we fail to destroy Hamas, we will be in any immediate danger of destruction. There's something more subtle at work, but subtle, long-term, but nevertheless, I would argue, acutely existential. And that is that what this war is about is restoring Israel's military credibility in the Middle East. If we allow October 7th to stand, we are on a long-term downward trajectory. We will be conveying to the region that we no longer have what it takes to defend ourselves. The lone non-Arab, non-Muslim state for thousands of kilometers around us must preserve its military credibility for its long-term survival. October 7th was such a devastating blow to us precisely because Hamas was the weakest of our enemies. We didn't take it seriously. We have never been dealt that kind of a strategic blow since 1948. And the fact that it came from Hamas only intensified the message, the devastating message of Israeli weakness. This war is about something else as well, and that is to restore the promise that Israel made to the Jewish people of creating a safe refuge, that there would be one place that Jews could depend on, wherever Jews were, in any part of the world. On October 7th, we lost Israel as a safe refuge. Israel failed to defend its own citizens within its own borders. This is a country which in 1976 sent commandos to Uganda, to Entebbe airport, to rescue 100 Israelis who were held hostage there. We couldn't save 1,200 Israelis in our own borders. This is an historic failure that we're going to carry for the rest of this generation. And so this war is about restoring two elements of Israel's credibility. The first is our military credibility in relation to our enemies in the region. The second is our historic credibility, the credibility of our promise internally to the Jewish people. That's how I understand this war as existential. Most of the Israeli left supports this war because, like other Israelis, it perceives this war through a very particular lens. There are two ways of understanding what this war is about. One is the way our critics define it, which is this is a war that was really an uprising by an occupied people, an act of desperation. That's one line. The other line, which is how almost all Israelis view this war, is that this was a war, almost an ecstatic attack by radical Islamism, whose goal is not peace, it's not a two-state solution, it's the destruction of Israel. For that reason, many Israelis on the left who devoted their lives to a two-state solution, who devoted their lives to trying to end the occupation, which I personally regard as a long-term disaster for Israel, those Israelis have lined up as well in favor of this war. And so that's part of the disconnect that an Israeli visiting the United States feels, to go from this sense of rare and precious Israeli consensus to a situation where I feel unmoored. I feel that Israel has been so profoundly misunderstood and misjudged. Another crucial way in which we perceive this war differently from how much of world opinion sees it is that for Israelis, this is not just Israel versus Hamas. The real war that began on October 7th is the Iranian-Israeli war. And we're fighting proxies. Right now, the primary front is Hamas, but we know that at any moment the front can move north to Hezbollah, and there is no difference between Hezbollah and Hamas except one, and that is that Hezbollah is a far more dangerous enemy. Hezbollah is an army. Hezbollah has 150,000 missiles and rockets aimed at every part of the Israeli home front. And many of those are precision missiles, which our anti-missile defense system, which has performed brilliantly, will be inadequate to deal with that level of threat. We can deal with Hamas's arsenal. We can't deal with Hezbollah's, let alone Iran and Syria and now the Houthis in Yemen. This has always been a regional war. It has never only been the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And that, again, is part of the disconnect in how Israelis perceive their situation and how much of the world sees it. For Israelis, this has always been experienced as a regional conflict. Until recently, until the last few years, it was the Sunni world against Israel. With the Abraham Accords and the beginning of a process of normalization, which hopefully will culminate with Saudi Arabia, we're seeing the historic end of the Sunni-Israeli war. At the same time, we've seen the rise of the Shiite Israeli war. The Shiite arc, which includes Syria, to some extent Iraq, Hezbollah, and Hamas, which is the only non-Shiite part of that coalition. And that is now the new front, the new regional front facing Israel. The question of the morality of this war. There's no question in my mind that Israel does not target innocent civilians. And the reason that I can say that unequivocally is because the Israeli army is not a volunteer army. It's not abstract for most of us. We are the army. We've served, our children serve, our neighbors. We know what's happening in Gaza because we're there. And we know the army from within. And the IDF does not target innocent civilians. Can I say unequivocally that we have done everything in our power this war to protect innocent lives? No. That I can't say. And I think that that's a combination of several factors. The first is that the Hamas infrastructure is almost completely entwined with civilian Gaza. There's no difference. Hamas is in the hospitals. It's in the schools. It's in the UN facilities. I'll give you an example. A friend of mine came back recently from a few months in Gaza. And I asked him, I said, so give me an example of what it's like. He said we were on patrol one day, and we came to a water purification facility. And there was a plaque on the wall that said, this is a gift from the people of Germany to the people of Gaza. In the water purification facility, we found the opening to a tunnel. And that's what the Israeli army is up against. In this war, we made two strategic decisions, which have affected the high rate of civilian casualties. The first is that we would not end this war without bringing Hamas down, which means that unlike all of the previous mini-wars that Israel has fought with Hamas, which were intended to contain Hamas, to prevent it from firing rockets across the border, this war has a far more ambitious goal. And the second strategic decision that Israel made was that this time Hamas would not be allowed immunity behind its civilians. Hamas would not be allowed to massacre our civilians, then go back across the border and hide behind their civilians. This time, we would go after Hamas wherever they were. We've gone into hospitals. We've gone into mosques, schools, and UN facilities. That's what's changed in this war. At the same time, I have to ask myself, is that all that's changed? And if I'm being honest with myself, I would say that no, something else has changed in this war, which is that young Israelis went into Gaza in a state of rage. The rage that all of us have felt and that we feel to this day. The rage is raw. And when you send young people into war where civilians are enmeshed with terrorists, there will be tragedies that shouldn't have happened. And so these are some of the factors that I'm trying to sort through. I'm trying to understand what is happening there. And then factor in the booby-trapped houses. Someone said to me that his unit experienced something like 70% booby-trapped apartments. The fact that Hamas fighters don't wear uniforms. It's impossible to tell the difference. A 30-year-old male Hamas civilian. These are the factors. This is what Israel is dealing with. There are two kinds of critiques of this war, two kinds of critics. The first critic says this war is illegitimate, and basically it's illegitimate because you're illegitimate. You have no right to exist. You're colonialist, racist, and now genocidal. Nazi Germany had no right to self-defense. South Africa had no right to self-defense. Israel has no right to self-defense. That's one line of criticism. And to those critics, I owe no moral accountability. My only response to those critics is to push back as hard as I can. Harder than they're pushing me. The second criticism comes from friends, from the Biden administration, from parts of the American Jewish community. I don't like the criticism. No Israeli likes to be criticized ever about anything, let alone during war, let alone during this kind of war. And still, we need to hear that criticism, and we need to respect that criticism and address it. And not to say we're fighting an existential war, you don't know what it's like. We need to hear the concerns of our friends. It seems to me that there is a dysfunctional discourse going on about this war. For our worst critics, for those who deny us legitimacy, it often seems as if Hamas doesn't exist in Gaza. Israel has declared war against 2 million Palestinian civilians. We're only fighting civilians in Gaza. There's no Hamas. And what really, in some ways, embodies that is the scandalous number of 30,000. 30,000 who? And that number is used almost universally. Israel has killed 30,000 Palestinians. We say that 14,000 of that 30,000 are Hamas. You don't see that in the New York Times. It's 30,000. And that sense that all casualties in Gaza are innocent, are the result of this Israeli war on a civilian population, this, to me, that number 30,000 really represents everything that's wrong about how Israel is being judged. On the other hand, it often seems in Israel, in our internal discourse, that there are no civilians in Gaza. They're all Hamas. And that's a problem too. And so it seems to me that the Jewish people needs to develop two simultaneous languages on how we speak about Israel. The first language is unequivocal pushback against those who would delegitimize us. The second language is a more internal critique. And there we have to ask ourselves hard questions. And it often seems that different parts of the Jewish community feel comfortable speaking one language or the other language. And we don't know how to speak both of those languages simultaneously. And so, for example, when we defend Israel against the hypocrisy of our critics, we'll say, where are you on China? Where are you on Myanmar? Where are you on all of the other genocidal and murderous wars, real genocidal wars that have happened? In our internal conversation, we need to ask ourselves, is that the company that we really want to be compared to? Do we really want to be compared to China and Assad's Syria? Well, we're better than them. Well, yes, we're better than them. And that is important to say to the hypocrites who want to turn us into the world's criminal state. But in our own internal conversation, we need a different language. A few words about power, powerlessness, and vulnerability. We are in a very strange loop at the moment. On the one hand, many Jews feel that we're back in Jewish history. We've lapsed back into the condition of victimhood. And we use the Holocaust as our frame of reference for October 7th. On the other hand, much of the world perceives us not as victims, but as victimizers. And I would argue that neither category, victim or victimizer, adequately explains Israel and this war. First, in terms of being victims. Our lapse back into the condition of victimhood lasted all of one day, October 7th. On October 8th, Israeli society made the crucial decision not to allow the perception of a return of Jewish victimhood to stand. And we made the decision that we would rather be hated than pitied. That's an old Israeli expression. Sometimes you have to be careful what you ask for. But that was the right call. And I was very uncomfortable, honestly, with the outpouring of sympathy for Israel after October 7th, because I knew it would last as long as Israel was perceived as the victim. The moment we began the counterattack, that would disappear. And it largely, of course, has. And the truth is, we can't complain about that, because that was our intention on October 8th, not to allow the perception of Jewish victimhood to stand. Now, I've said several times over this evening, and I'll repeat it again, the war in Gaza is a terrible necessity. Still, the fact that we have devastated so much of Gaza, the fact that so much of Gaza looks like Berlin 1945, means that we have forfeited our right to be victims. We're not victims. At the same time, we're not victimizers, because what we're doing in Gaza is what any country would do in our place. At the least, they would be doing exactly what we're doing now. And so neither victim nor victimizer. But I'd like to take this a level further. And that is the whole question of our relationship to power. In 1945, the Jewish people made a decision that powerlessness had become unsustainable, literally untenable. And we embraced sovereignty and power. The pre-Holocaust Jewish world was deeply divided over Zionism. There were large and powerful Jewish anti-Zionist movements. There was the Jewish Socialist Bund, which was the largest Jewish political party in pre-Holocaust Poland. The entire ultra-Orthodox world was anti-Zionist. Parts of the Reform movement was already transitioning to Zionism, but parts still remained anti-Zionist. And so the Jewish world was deeply divided over the question of Zionism and a return to power and sovereignty. That debate was resolved by the Holocaust, and the Jewish people, almost in its entirety, committed itself to the reclamation of power. And power took two forms. In Israel, it was hard power, military power. In the diaspora, especially in American Jewry, it was soft power. American Jews learned how to lobby. American Jews learned how to create alliances. The American Jewish community before the Holocaust was not the same community afterwards. This became a community that frankly embraced power. And so what we're experiencing today is an assault on the legitimacy of the Jewish reclamation of power. That's really what this war is about. And this is a moment where I would argue we need to re-embrace that decision that the generation after the Holocaust made, not to remain powerless, not to remain virtuous and powerless. When you assume power, you are losing your innocence. I don't know if the Jewish people was fully aware of that consequence in 1945. Maybe it's only now with this Gaza war that we're fully aware of the price, the moral price, that a people pays for reclaiming power. And so the reclamation of power requires responsibility. The first responsibility is to examine the moral consequences of what you do, to weigh the strategic goals, the strategic necessity of using power with the moral price. And that's what we're doing in this moment. The second consequence of embracing power is to recognize that you no longer are entitled to being a victim. You should not want to be a victim, and you don't deserve to be a victim. You are now a player on the world stage. And that's where the Jewish people are. One of the gaps that I sense, certainly among parts of young American Jews, is a kind of nostalgia for the age of Jewish innocence, the age of powerlessness. Now, growing up in a Holocaust survivor family, I was taught that the worst condition for the Jewish people, the most immoral condition for a people that is hated and a people that is vulnerable is powerlessness. Powerlessness for Jews is immoral. This is a message that American Jews need to re-embrace. And so we're really struggling in a way. Your community is struggling. In Israel, we're not struggling, and maybe I wish we were struggling at least a little bit. I wish American Jewry was struggling a little less, and we were struggling a little more. Maybe that's something we can learn from each other. But what American Jews really are poised between is October 7th, which was a reminder of the disastrous consequences of powerlessness, and October 8th, when we made the decision to devastate our neighbors. These are the two poles that we're living between now. And again, in Israel, we have unequivocally embraced October 8th. And the challenge for American Jews is to figure out, where do you belong? Are you nostalgic for powerlessness? For the purity of the powerless. And the powerless do have purity. There's a wonderful passage in the medieval Jewish philosophical work, the Kuzari by Yehuda Halevi, which is a kind of a mythical encounter or debate between a rabbi, a priest, and an imam. And they appear before the pagan king of the Khazars. And the rabbi says to the king, and the king is struggling with which of these three monotheistic faiths he should embrace. And the rabbi says to the king, well, you should embrace Judaism because we're the most moral of these three faiths. We don't harm anyone. And the king said, well, that's true now because you don't have the ability to harm anyone. Let's see what happens to the Jews if they ever regain power. That's a really important message from 1,000 years ago in Jewish history. And so that's a piece of it. Nevertheless, the commitment, the decision that the Jewish people made in 1945 needs to be reaffirmed. A couple of last points. There's never one last point for a Jewish speaker. There's one last point, and then there's the last point after the last point. Some thoughts about the morning after for the Palestinians and the morning after for the Israelis. In Israel, the first order of business, before we can really even conceive of the very long and painful process of healing Israeli society, is bringing this government down. This government, over the last year and a half, has presented Israelis with two scenarios of our destruction. One was internal, and that was playing out over the last year, where we had a government that declared war against our democratic institutions. Now, I know that in America you can't conceive of such a thing. We actually have a leader who doesn't respect the country's democratic institutions. But we did experience that in Israel. We are still experiencing that. And Israeli society nearly unraveled from within over the last year. The second scenario of destruction that Netanyahu's government presented us with was October 7th, which is destruction from without. That's what it would look like. That's what, God forbid, the destruction of Israel would look like. And so this government of national catastrophe must go. What makes me hopeful about Israel is that we were able to pivot from the deepest divide that this country has ever known, which was the fight over our democratic identity over the last year, to instantly reclaiming our national solidarity. We went from unprecedented divisiveness on October 6th to a level of national unity that I don't think this country experienced since maybe the Yom Kippur War in 1973. And that was extraordinary. If you had asked me when we were out on the streets last year, would we ever be capable of that level of national solidarity again, I don't think I would have believed it. And so we've relearned the instincts of national solidarity. And this is the moment that I would define as the coming of age of Israeli society, the moment that we've matured as a people. And I say that because we have never gone to war before with total lack of faith in the decency of our leadership. Israelis always question the wisdom of their leaders during war. That's a long Israeli tradition. In the weeks leading up to the Six-Day War, Israelis were convinced that Levi Eshkol was a bumbling fool. He turned out to be, I think, one of our best prime ministers. Golda Meir was driven out of office, hounded out of office for her failures in the Yom Kippur War. Menachem Begin was driven out of office for his failure in the Lebanon War of 1982. But Israelis never doubted the decency of their leaders. They never doubted that their leaders placed the national interest ahead of their own personal political interests. Not this time. Every poll that I've seen that asks Israelis, does Netanyahu prioritize the national interest or his own political interest? A strong majority says he cares more about himself than the hostages, than winning the war, than defeating Hamas, than the well-being of the country. I don't believe that in the past Israelis could have gone to war with such total lack of faith in the decency of our leaders. But what happened on October 8th is that we mobilized ourselves. Nobody I know waited to hear what Netanyahu had to say. Nobody waited to be inspired by Netanyahu. Everyone knew what they needed to do. People showed up to their reservist units who hadn't been called up. There was a 150% turnout response to the reservist call-up. Something like 50% of Israelis participated in some form of voluntarism in the weeks after October 7th. 50%. I don't know of another society anywhere that would approach those numbers. And so what we've relearned is how to take responsibility for ourselves, how to mobilize ourselves. And that, I believe, is going to carry us forward. I think we're going to see the emergence of a new generation of Israeli political leaders, a much healthier generation than mine. And so I'm an Israeli optimist. And what that means is that in the short term, I think it's going to be a disaster. It's going to, whatever you think it's going to be, it will be, and worse. That's an Israeli optimist. But in the long term, things are going to start to return to some semblance of normalcy. And the last comment really is about the Palestinian tragedy. And how do we conceive of a way forward? The Israeli dilemma, which precedes October 7th, regarding a Palestinian state, is that on the one hand, and this is certainly my position, and it has been my position almost since moving to Israel in 1982. On the one hand, a Palestinian state is an existential necessity for Israel. Never mind the Palestinians. We desperately need to extricate ourselves from ruling over another people. We did not come home to rule another people and deny their place, their home. And the demographic threat of permanent occupation, the moral disaster, the declining place of Israel internationally. For all those reasons and more, we desperately need a two-state solution. We need a Palestinian state. On the other hand, and there's always another hand in Israel, a Palestinian state is potentially an existential threat to us. The West Bank borders Israel's heartland. The West Bank highlands overlook 70% of the Israeli population. Greater Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, it's all concentrated along the West Bank border. If Hamas were to take over the West Bank, we would face a situation of looking at October 7th as the new norm, the Israeli norm. Which is why today, if you ask any Israeli, virtually, should there be a Palestinian state, the answer will be overwhelmingly impossible. I spoke recently with a friend of mine who is one of the founders of the Peace Now movement, which has been devoted to the premise of a two-state solution. And I said to him, so where are you at politically now? He said, we can't do a Palestinian state. And I was shocked. This is a man who's devoted his life to trying to convince his fellow Israelis that we must have a Palestinian state. So that's one side of the equation. The other side is that October 7th really has two takeaways. One takeaway is we can't risk a Palestinian state in the West Bank. The second takeaway, though, the opposite takeaway, is that these two peoples cannot live together in one political entity between the river and the sea. Ariel Sharon was right when he dismantled the settlements in Gaza and pulled us out. Imagine if we were living in one political entity with Gaza. We would be internalizing October. October 7th would be the Israeli norm. And so I think that as the trauma of October 7th gradually recedes, many Israelis will begin to rethink their reflexively emotional, understandably emotional response, opposition to a two-state solution, and rethink and really ask ourselves, well, what's the alternative? And I'm terrified of a Palestinian state. The only thing that frightens me a little bit more, and just barely, is the absence of a Palestinian state in the long term. And so that's the issue that we're debating. How can this happen? How can we envision a Palestinian state? It's not going to happen in negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians. That track is finished. We know, both sides know, every position of the other, inside out. There are no surprises left. But what's changed is the region. The fact that Israel now has Arab allies, and even just saying those words, Israel's Arab allies, I can't get used to that. You know, I grew up in, as I think most people here, in the 1960s and 70s with the notion that the Arab world's enmity to Israel is immutable. In 1973, Israel's most formidable enemies, after the Yom Kippur War, it wasn't Egypt or Syria that had invaded. It was Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states who used the oil weapon to turn Israel into a pariah. Much of the world broke off relations with Israel in response to Arab oil pressure that came from the countries that today are leading the process of normalization with Israel. Now that for me is almost messianic. It's so surreal to think of Saudi Arabia, which was Israel's most bitter enemy. Saudi Arabia was the center point of anti-Semitism in the world. Today, Saudi Arabia is rewriting its textbooks to eliminate anti-Semitism. And so my hope is that we can begin to think of solving the Palestinian problem in a regional context. Again, it's not going to happen in the old Oslo process scenario. We need to forget everything that went wrong and not adopt that as our model for the future. We have an alternative possibility, and that is really the Saudis, the Gulf states, Morocco, Egypt, maybe Jordan, coming in, helping Israel with security arrangements to ensure that a Palestinian state doesn't turn radical, and because it is in their interests as well, and economic investments, developing an infrastructure for a future Palestinian state. That's as far as I will allow myself to dream at a moment where any dream at all really seems so counterintuitive as to be almost absurd. But we are in the period of Israel's secular high holidays. We are moving toward Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel Independence Day. And I think what we owe ourselves as a people is the reminder of the capacity to continue dreaming and continue hoping. So thank you all very much.
Yossi, you've given us, not surprisingly, a lot to think about. Yossi, you've given us a lot. Are we working now? Yeah, we're good, thank you. Yossi, you've given us a lot to think about. Not long before tonight, but certainly with this talk tonight. And we want to take a few minutes to have some questions from everybody. If you've got one, I already see a hand up. So we've got, Dan and I will be walking around with the microphones. Do remember, as demonstrated here, speak directly right into the microphone. And remember, of course, that a question ends with a question mark. So, then we're going to start over.
Hi. Thank you for this very informative overview. And I'm going to have trouble articulating this question, and maybe you can help me get to the heart of it. So when we all walked in, I think the first thing that we saw were these posters. The hostages were the first point of reference we had for what you were going to speak about. And I think that the tremendous power that Israel has shown throughout this campaign in part derives from a willingness to prioritize the long-term strength of the country over these hostages. There seems to me to be a maybe not quite a resignation, but a willingness to accept a potential outcome where they don't survive, not a one of them. And I grapple with that, and I grapple with the long-term implications of that. In the short term, there's a power. We've effectively said to the enemies, we're not going to let these hostages hold us hostage.
So let's work on a question mark there.
Yeah.
The question mark, I think the question, as I understand it, the question is, are Israelis, or should Israelis, prioritize one or the other? Is it rescuing the hostages or defeating Hamas? Until the last few weeks, which is to say really from October 8th, Israelis told themselves that there's no contradiction. In fact, the more force we use, the closer we get to convincing Hamas that they have no choice but to release them. And we had some indication that that strategy was working in the first few exchanges. We had the best, numerically, the most advantageous exchanges with Hamas, prisoner exchanges that we've ever had. In the past, it was always an exorbitant number of prisoners that Israel would release in exchange for a handful of our own people. Now, in the first exchanges, the ratio was much more acceptable. But Hamas, I think, has sensed several things. One is that we don't have an end plan, that much of the world is against us, that the administration is starting to waver. All of these have, I think, strengthened, and also the demonstrations within Israeli society for the release of the hostages, which I think are a tactical mistake. I do think it strengthens Hamas's sense that time is on their side. So all of these factors have contributed to a hardening of Hamas's position. Israelis are very divided, and government supporters believe, and they're a minority, but they're a strong minority, they believe that we need to prioritize the defeat of Hamas. And a majority of the country, if pushed to a decision, would say we need to bring the hostages home, even if it means not winning the war, which is, I mean, that's more or less my position today, but it's unbearable to actually imagine reaching that moment where we would see Sinwar emerging from the ruins, waving the V symbol, and Hamas reconstituting itself. That, for me, is an unthinkable outcome of this time. But if we prioritize the release of the hostages, that may well happen.
Hi, my name is Ruben Rabinovich. I'm from Madison.
Excuse me, you've got to talk right into it. Kiss it.
Love it. Okay. I enjoyed your presentation. Thank you very much. I have a question, and I would appreciate it if you could clarify one of your comments that attracted my attention. You said powerless victims. Once you have the power and you're attacked, you're not the victim. And doesn't sit well with me as an Israeli and an American. When I read through history, since the first terror attack in the history of Zionism, which took place in 1920, the Nebi Samuel pogrom by Arabs against the Zionists, the Jews, in fact. They're even not Zionists, it happened in Jerusalem, in which 7 Jews were murdered and 200 were injured because of some dispute about some benches in the Wailing Wall in the Kotel. Nothing has changed. There's not a single day in which violence and or terror is inflicted on Israelis, and before 48 on the Jews or Zionists. So I think the sense of being a victim never disappeared from in the Israeli narrative, in the Israeli core of feelings. The Arabs, if you ask them and the Palestinians, they are the victims. They are the eternal victims, and we are the eternal aggressors. So for them, the fact that we built an army didn't change anything. But I think that from the Israeli side, the fact that we have the power doesn't change the fact that we are still victims.
So I would distinguish between being attacked and being victims. When victims who are attacked don't have the ability to hit back. They're in a condition of victimhood. They're in a condition of powerlessness. And we are not, thank God, in that position. We're attacked, and we hit back as strongly or stronger than we've been hit. And that's been the Israeli approach from the beginning, that you hit back harder than you get hit. And that's what we've done again. We've done that, I think, quite decisively over these last months. But there's another element here that I really want to just play out for a moment, which is that we are living in a moment where we're not victims anymore, we're not victimizers, but we are vulnerable. And that's true for Israelis, and it's also now true for diaspora Jews. And we don't know how to inhabit that ambiguous space of power. We have power, but we're also vulnerable at the same time. And so the way that's playing out in American Jewry are the articles that are appearing eulogizing the golden era of American Jewry. The golden era is over, and what was is over. But there is a vast spectrum between the Golden Era and Weimar Germany. And we don't know yet as a people, psychologically, we don't know how to inhabit that uneasy space where on the one hand we have power and on the other hand we are vulnerable. And it's especially difficult for us to navigate that space psychologically while we are being systematically denounced as the arch criminals and accused of crimes that we didn't commit and essentially being called a successor to Nazi Germany. It's very difficult psychologically under those when you're at the receiving end of that kind of attack to have a nuanced and sober assessment of your situation. So that's part of what our dilemma is today.
When you were talking before about power and soft power and hard power, I think we need to think a little bit more about how in America, the left in general and the Jewish left has been willing to use soft power without realizing that when you're in the United States, any power is hard power because you're the United States. And so I think, it's a question of, I'm not quite sure what my question is. But the question is,
Why should you be the first to ask a question?
how do you sort of, the shift that Israelis have been forced to understand about power? How do you change that in the diaspora to get that understanding about power?
Yeah, I would say that I would expand that question. The dilemma is how do we, on the one hand, encourage diaspora Jews to reaffirm the embrace of power that the generation of American Jews made after the Holocaust? And how do we get Israelis to have a more nuanced understanding of power and the responsibilities of power? And I would broaden that further by saying that what worries me about the long-term nature of the American Jewish-Israeli relationship is that that relationship has traditionally been based on, I'm looking for the two flags on the bima, and they're not here. Okay. So the two flags on the bima, the Israeli flag and the American flag. And what those two flags always meant to me was an understanding of our shared values, to Jewish continuity and to democracy and pluralism. And in an Israeli context, that means a Jewish state and a democratic state. Now, those are two identities that are not always easy to combine. But in Israel that is not committed to maintaining the struggle to hold those two identities together is not an Israel that we would recognize. And that's what Netanyahu's government tried to do over this last year, was to tear apart the Jewish and democratic. And what's happening, what I fear is happening in parts of Israeli society and parts of the American Jewish community is that we're pulling in opposite ideological directions. Growing numbers of young Israelis are questioning whether we need democracy. That a country that is facing the kind of existential threats that we face, for us, democracy is a luxury. To have the Supreme Court intervene in military decisions is a luxury that a country under siege can't afford. And that's the position of Ben Gvir and Smotrich. And that's a growing segment, still a minority, but growing. In the American Jewish community, you have the opposite process. You have a growing number of young Jews, still very much a minority, and the polls show it, but nevertheless very vocal, as we've heard in recent weeks, that is turning away from the legitimacy of a Jewish state. And so if parts of Israel negate the democratic identity of Israel, and parts of American Jewry negate the Jewish identity of Israel, what we're going to see, God forbid, is tearing apart the relationship. And that's what we need to fight for. We need to strengthen Israeli democracy, and we need to strengthen Zionism among American Jews. You didn't ask that question, but that's my. But I also don't have to give answers to questions that weren't asked.
I have a very simple question. No statement. The question is, you'd say we have to have a two-state solution. There has to be a Palestinian state. Without that, we have an existential threat to the existence of Israel. Where do you put this existential threat?
Where do you put the Palestinian
Where
state?
do you put the Palestinian state? You can't have two separate pieces of land
Right.
on either side of the country and call that a state.
Some people, some Israelis have suggested, only half joking, a three-state solution. There'll be a fundamentalist Islamist state in Gaza. There'll be a non-Islamist state in the West Bank. I don't know. It's a really important question. In the 90s, there was talk about President Clinton, according to his plan, talked about a road or a tunnel connecting these two pieces of land. Right now, it's inconceivable. That's the truth. And there is no peace now. That's not, that slogan needs to be erased from the lexicon. There's not going to be any solution anytime soon. But what I personally want to see is an Israeli government that is slowly changing the direction from annexation, which is where we're heading now, a binational, single, dysfunctional state of Palestinians and Israelis between the river and the sea, which is the vision that's shared by the right and by the anti-Zionist left. It's the same vision, except the only question is who's going to be in charge at the expense of which people. For the anti-Zionists, it'll be the Palestinians in charge, and the Jews will have to basically disappear. For the right, and especially the far right, we will be in charge of this big binational state, and eventually the Palestinians will either acquiesce or leave or be thrown out. These are the two visions, right? The far left and the far right. In the end, not a surprise, they converge. So I don't know. I don't have an answer for you. I don't have an answer for myself. I don't know anyone in Israel today who does. But the starting point needs to be that a one-state arrangement is the greatest threat for Israel. Whoever's in control, whether it's the Palestinians or the Israelis, who's ever in control of this one state, this is a recipe for permanently internalizing the conflict. And so I would rather deal with the conflict from the border, even though October 7th places a big question mark on what happens when we let our guard down and we're bordering that kind of threat. So all I can say at this moment is we're going to need a long-term process. Will there be a Palestinian state at the end of it? I don't know. Is it possible? It will depend in large part on the Palestinians. They can't be forced to have a state. Sometimes I feel that Israel is going to need to coerce the Palestinians into having a state. Because the only deal that the Palestinian leadership would accept is a deal that would mean the destruction of Israel. We would have to accept millions of descendants of refugees from 1948. Instead of them going to a Palestinian state, they would go to Israel. Those are the terms. And that's why the Palestinian leadership always rejects any offer that's on the table. And I don't know of another national movement of a stateless people anywhere that has rejected more offers of statehood than the Palestinian leadership. And so, will there be a Palestinian state? It could have happened in 1947. It could have happened in 2000. It could have happened in 2009, when Ehud Olmert put the offer to Mahmoud Abbas, and he never heard back from him. He said, let's do it right now. Here's the map. 100% of the land. Sign. No, you're not getting refugees returning to the state of Israel. We'll redivide Jerusalem. We'll uproot dozens of settlements. Here's the map. Let's sign. So, will there be a Palestinian state? We can't create it for them. So I don't know. Will the Israeli public be able to overcome its trauma to the point where it will think politically, rationally, what might be a way out? I don't know the answer to that either. There are so many variables here. Is it too much to hope for the Saudis and the Gulf states to bail us out? Maybe. Maybe that's unrealistic. But at the very least, we need to be making an effort to move away from a one state toward the possibility, eventually, I can't be more cautious, the eventual possibility of a two-state solution.
Yossi, you're up for two more questions?
Sure.
We got one here regarding one, but then those will be the last two. Go ahead.
How would you advise us to respond to those fellow Americans, and I hear this particularly among younger Americans, including younger Jewish Americans, how would you advise us to respond to the criticism that says Israel brought this on? It was the behavior of Israel, the treatment of Israel, of the Palestinians in the settlements in Gaza that's responsible.
There are several answers that I would offer, that I have offered in these last months. I've spoken on campuses in the last few months. And the first point is what I made earlier, which is that Hamas's agenda is not ending the occupation, it's ending Israel. For Hamas, Israel is, by definition, an occupation. Tel Aviv is a settlement. Hamas refers to the kibbutzim that were taken over on October 7th as settlements. Those are Israeli villages within the internationally recognized border of Israel. But for Hamas, it's all an occupation. The existence of the founding of Israel was an act of occupation. And by the way, for Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority, it's the same thing. Let's not fool ourselves. Sometimes when I read Tom Friedman, and he makes these elaborate distinctions between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, he's right that there are practical distinctions, but not ideological. And that's really important to remember. But so that's one answer, is that Hamas's agenda, even if there were a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, with a road connecting going through Israel, the war would continue because Israel's existence is a crime. And what this conflict has done, the one where I would agree that this conflict does have echoes of the past, is that it has brought the legitimacy of Jewish existence, the right of the Jews to exist, is back on the international agenda. What Europe used to call the Jewish problem, the problem of Jewish existence, is back. And so that's first of all. Secondly, everyone seems to have forgotten 2005. What happened in 2005? Anyone? 2005? Everyone except Gary. Yes. We withdrew from Gaza. Now, when I say that, the critics push back and say, yeah, but you kept the siege on. We reinstituted the siege when Hamas came to power in 2007 and started firing rockets. That's when the siege of Gaza began. And so it's cause and effect is backwards. We withdrew from Gaza. For the first time in this conflict, there was a part of Palestinian territory that they controlled. And imagine if they would have said, okay, we're going to use this as the first step toward showing what a independent Palestinian state can do, can look like. That's not what happened. All of the foreign aid went into the terror infrastructure. It didn't go into the civilian infrastructure. So that's the beginning of an answer for me.
Yossi, one last question over here.
Hi. I'm a historical novelist, and I write about some of this history. And for 10 years now, I've been warning, this is coming, this is coming, this is coming.
What's your most recent book?
My most recent book I have for you, actually, here.
Oh, wonderful.
It's called Berliners, but my first book was about the post-Holocaust period. And so my question to you is, one author to another, I write in the young adult genre, which is extremely toxic, as you can imagine. What is working in terms of your communication with young people? You said you've been speaking on campuses. What advice do you have for me as far as what is working to communicate past divides to people who are actually willing to listen? Thank you.
You know, my experience this time around on campuses was very different from any experience that I had before. And what I'm going to tell you will be the opposite of what you would have assumed from that statement. I've spoken for years on campuses. I've been disrupted, demonstrated against. But I always managed to attract a diverse audience, not only Jewish kids who were committed to Israel, but lots of other kids who were curious, some hostile. That's why there were disruptions. This time around, there were no disruptions at all. I was at Berkeley, Columbia, Stanford, Northwestern, Penn, no disruptions. But the only kids who came were the Jewishly committed ones, which makes me feel that the Israel conversation on campus has become entirely self-referential. We're talking to ourselves. And I know how to talk to those kids. I don't know if I know how to talk to the wider campus culture in a way that I thought I once did. But what I've learned from the Jewish students on these campuses is that we shouldn't only be focusing on the immediate threat of these demonstrations and lockdowns and even the anti-Semitic incidents. The real threat is that the vocal minority of anti-Zionist protesters are shaping the general culture on campus, including among many students who are apolitical. And that's what worries me more than anything else, that we are in danger of losing a generation. And how to speak to them, I don't know. You know, I'm working on a book now, which is something like a long letter. It's not a letter. You can only do that once as a writer, but it is kind of a long letter from a 20th century Jew to a 21st century Jew. And all I can do is speak my language. I don't speak their language. But that's really how generational continuity of values works. You know, my parents didn't agonize about how do we get our American child to understand our European experience. They told me what they thought was important for me to know based on what they thought was important. And then you sort it out. That's part of one's maturation process. And so all we can do for the next generation is tell them why Israel matters to us, why the mid-20th century Jewish story, which is now under systematic attack, is one of the greatest stories, not only in Jewish history, but I think in human history. And that's a story that's worth defending and standing with. So beyond that, I don't think we can really, I don't think we can try to speak to them in their language. We need to find our language.
A few things. Jerry? Now, a few things. First off, this is a very nice beamer. You'll come back again. We always love having you here. And again, thank you to all of my colleagues who participated. Cantor Sugarman, we're going to bring you up as well. Jerry Klein has a presentation on behalf of the Jewish Federation, and then we will end with Hatikva.
Thank you so much for your insights. On behalf of everybody here and our sponsors, thank you so much.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you.
Safe travels, too.
Thank you.
Thank you. For those who are able, we invite you to stay and kindly rise for Hatikva.
Please, I'll be right behind you.
Call on Baleva, Hanima, Nefesh Yehudi, Homia, Uvate Mizrach, Kadima, Ayin Letzion, Sophia, all of the Tikvatenu, Hatikva, Bachnot Abayim, Liotam Chofshi, Be'atzenu, Eretz Zion, Yerushalayim.